Thank you, Greg, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along on a busy day to have a listen to what we've been up to and some of the thoughts we have around what's happening in Northern WA, some of the opportunities and challenges. Just quickly, I'll introduce myself, Chris Ham. I'm the Senior Development Officer here for the Department of Primary Industry and Regional Development. I work in the Horticulture and Irrigated Agriculture Directorate of that department, and I'm here with my colleague, Carla Milazzo, who's also in the development space, which is a very handy researcher as well, as you'll find out a bit later in the presentation. Firstly, I guess we were, the last time we did a webinar like this was 2019. So the first part of my talk will really be around just introducing, I guess, where we were in 2019 and some of the things that have happened between then and now. And then Carla will have a talk about a project that we've just completing and some of the results of the work there that's contributing to help our industry make the best decisions that they can with the best data that they can. In terms of the part of the world that we're talking about, so we obviously have very close ties with our colleagues over in the Ord, and you know, Kununurra has long been the Ord River Irrigation Scheme has long been a feature of the Kimberley, but we work in the part of the world between the Ord and further south into Carnarvon. So in the time, in the last 20 years, we've seen an increase in investment into irrigation, and those developments are quite geographically diverse. They're sort of spread between Broome, Fitzroy Crossing, Port Hedland, and even further south, even down to Tom Price. So this map is showing the area in which we predominantly work, not exclusively, but predominantly. And where there's a green dot, there's an irrigation development of some kind. And if we think about what does that mean in terms of statistics and area, our best assessment of that is around 2,500 hectares of irrigated fodder or some kind of development on a pastoral lease, usually, which is generally around fodder and fodder production. We have some really significant horticultural developments as well, which we also deal with. They tend to be businesses in the south that want to grow off-season produce here in the north, generally during our dry season. Interestingly, we've just come out of 2 days of quite heavy rain. We've had over 100 millimetres here in Broome and even heavier falls around the place. So it's been a very wet start to the dry season, but that's not unusual. And then further south of us, we have some quite significant developments, some of whom are probably online, and there's quite major developments into irrigated fodder production on pastoral leases. Down in the Pilbara, we have some quite significant developments, and even some developments that involve mine dewatering. So they're quite interesting as well, where you have a mining company who has a pastoral lease and also then has bolted on an agricultural operation to that. In terms of what do some of these things look like, generally they're a mix of drip irrigation and sprinkler irrigation, and usually centre pivots, groundwater based. Broadly speaking, we have two different aquifers. Excuse me. We have artesian aquifers, which are pressurised, and they're extremely productive groundwater systems which can produce large volumes of water, which mean that basically no pumping is required. So they're able to run the irrigation system without the need to pump. Very expensive to develop, but a very productive asset. Alternatively, we have the shallower aquifers, which are not pressurised, and they require a bore, a turbine pump or monopump to lift water and distribute it across the landscape. This is quite different, I suppose, to the Ord, which is surface irrigation and black soils. But we have seen, you know, some very highly productive areas, and they generally range from 20 hectares to, you know, maybe around 900 hectares. So in 2019, we finished our presentation with this slide, and we were basically, I guess I was quoting Jim Trandos, who's one of the co-owners of Shalimar Horticulture, and he was at a conference in Darwin, and he said, so many people say to him, you know, it must be lovely to sit up there and watch the sunset over your farm, and it's, you know, very romantic. And he sort of coined the phrase that, you know, there's really no romance involved. It's quite a risky business, and it's all he sees is risk. And I thought it was an interesting statement because Jim's a very well-established businessman, and I thought he would be fairly comfortable with risk. But it really is a stunning landscape, but it is a very difficult investment to take on. And a lot of people have asked us over the years, you know, is the investment justified? And I think we've demonstrated over this time that it's certainly very challenging, it's very complex, it's expensive, and it's also a lot to take on. It really is a 365-day-a-year job. It doesn't have to be, but to make it work, it really does have to be. And that requires a lot of skill. It's hard to find people who want to live up here and really develop their skills over a long period of time. The workforce is even more challenging, so trying to find workers, particularly during COVID and the aftermath of COVID. But certainly in terms of an economic investment, it certainly does pay. And you know, individually, the reasons for people to invest in that can differ. I think every station would have a different reason that's driving their investment. They have a different strategy, they have different genetics, they have a different purpose, but they all see value in the investment. So since 2019 and now, I guess I'd like to go across some of the things that have changed, that are different, some of the challenges, and some of the advancements that we have made. So in terms of why people are investing in growing fodder in particular, it's a really interesting question, because if you ask the same question in the southwest or the wetter parts of the top end, plenty of people would say, you know, I've crunched the numbers and, you know, fodder isn't really that valuable. However, in our situation, it is, and it's also interesting because it's over the many years that I've worked up here, we've always looked for a crop that we can export, and really fodder in the context of the West Kimberley is really like an inwardly focused supply chain. So we were bringing fodder in when we didn't have this investment, and we're basically self-supplying and or trading between neighbours. So in that context, the economics are really highly related to isolation and freight costs. So if you can produce something cheaper than you can buy it and freight it in, then that becomes viable. It's particularly driven, unlike the top end, particularly the wet parts of the top end, by rainfall. So a lot of the areas that I just showed you on the map before are below the 800mm line, and really growing any kind of dry land crop that involves grain or high quality fodder is extremely difficult, if not, I never like using the word impossible, but it's close to impossible. It certainly wouldn't give you good results. There are some plants which will survive in terms of improved pasture that will give you a higher plane of nutrition than the natural pastures. But we have a different issue there, which is really around the pastoral tenure in WA and the policy settings. So this is changing, and it's one of the things I'll talk about later. But up until now, there really hasn't been a lot of support for improved pastures. So generally speaking, in Western Australia, the reliance is very heavy on native pastures and what they're able to do and how you manage them, and that generally comes down to the ability to put in infrastructure and watering points and maximise your grazing potential. In terms of getting a high plane of nutrition, that really meant that we had to take that step into intensive irrigation production. Along the sort of same lines, I guess back in 2011, when the live export ban came in and all the controversy and the impacts of that, we were almost solely reliant on the Indonesian market, and a small percentage of cattle would go south or east. In that time, we've seen the Kimberley Meat Company come and go, and it's in mothballed at the moment, but there is a very strong push to revive that by early next year. It has been in operation off and on over the last 6 years. We've also seen some micro abattoirs come out, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. And we're also seeing an increase in markets for heavier cattle, and the challenge then is how to provide those heavier cattle. But firstly, across the region, I think some of the things, the bigger picture things that I've seen change are the emergence of some really exciting First Nations-led projects, and they're not, they're things that are still yet to come online, but they are really being driven from the ground up within Aboriginal organisations, and there's at least 3 examples here in the West Kimberley, and I think they're a really encouraging sign, because they're not the kind of projects that are being forced because of a compensatory deal or because somebody else wanted to develop something and this is a spin-off. They're actually really looking at engaging in their own development and their own aspirations, and I think that's a great thing to see. A really good example here is the Aria Group, who have the Roebuck Export Depot. They have the Roebuck Station, and they have almost a fully approved irrigation development to couple with that, and it's a really good news story, I think. One thing we've seen is that we probably had a honeymoon period of about 10 years ago where there was a strong political support for land and water development in the north. A lot of the projects that I showed you before came out of that period, and I guess the global situation has changed, the interest rates have changed, and we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown in that rate of development, but there's certainly still new projects emerging, about the rate of 1 every year or so. The government in the meantime has reviewed some of the tenure options for pastoral leases and created the opportunity for a diversification lease. It's predominantly around some of the bigger picture ideas that are floating around, things like hydrogen and carbon projects, to allow companies who own pastoral leases to take advantage of those markets. In terms of intensive agriculture, it has provided an option if you were going to consider a diversification lease, you could include that in there. I think most people in the main part would stick with the diversification permits that we operate under currently. Coupled with that is an increase in water planning in the Kimberley. So in 2019, there was only actually 2 areas in the Kimberley that had water allocation plans, and now there's quite a concerted effort to manage the water allocation plan in the Fitzroy Valley. That hasn't been an easy job, but it's certainly underway, and there'll be discussions around that coming up this year as well. And as always, political support waxes and wanes. I think the 2 elections that happened this year have quite clearly shown where the Labor Party sees its priorities, and in terms of our regions, we have regional ministers for the first time allocated to understand what's going on in a region, and having that political support is really important, and also our social license. As you pretty much can't go to a conference these days without somebody talking about the importance of social license. And I guess we are very cognizant of the fact that our research needs to support that. I think some of the advancements that we've made is, we're seeing, if you to describe the Kimberley and the Pilbara cropping systems, they're all a little bit unique and they build on their strengths. So, for example, in the West Kimberley, we're able to produce large amounts of biomass, and some of Carla's points later on will sort of clarify exactly how much. Whereas in the East Kimberley, fibre and grain are probably, the more productive systems in that context. What's important is the synergy between those things. So we focus on what we're good at, and we try to get a synergy with someone else who's good at doing something different that can spin off to us. So an example would be cotton and maize production in the Ord has byproducts that are exceptionally useful for pastoralists who are able to produce large amounts of fodder to create a ration, for example. And that really helps the farmers in the Ord because they have a market for second-grade produce that isn't going to suit another market, or it's able to be sold locally before they have to pay freight to get it to somewhere else. I think we've really improved in terms of all of the things that support industry and our capacity and our knowledge and our understanding. If we look at, for example, grazing roads grass directly, in 2019 there was more questions than answers, and I think we've got quite a good understanding, or certainly a greatly improved understanding of how to do that. We're seeing an increase in specialist service provision, and so it's electricians, for example, that understand centre pivots, water infrastructure providers, and so forth. And I think we're seeing a much more greatly enhanced level of collaboration across the industries, and a lot more conversations are happening now between the farmers in the Ord and the pastoralists in the West. However, as always, many people will tell you Western Australia is a complex place to operate, and quite often it's compared to the NT or Queensland, where some of the pastoral lease conditions are different, and certainly that's the case. However, we can't let that slow us down. So we really need to focus on what can we do and how can we impact that. And throwing our hands up in frustration is not an option. So it's really, I think, engendering that political support and having that balance between protection and development, and trying to work out, okay, well, how can we have a really balanced conversation, and what, more importantly, what data do we have around our environmental impact that can then support both that political support to give them the confidence to have our back and set, and then work with our communities who are concerned about these impacts, how we can actually have an evidence-based discussion. Regulation is only going to get more complicated, and unfortunately there's many attempts to reduce it. I think the way in which to do that is to really focus on policy and process. So if policies don't make sense, or they're not impacting the industry in the way that it's intended, then they're things that we can discuss and work through and negotiate. And sometimes it's just the process itself. The legislation is relatively straightforward. We understand that. We understand there needs to be regulation. Sometimes it's just the way in which it's managed that actually frustrates people more than anything else. And quite often that's connecting between departments, and a lot of our team's work is, as much as possible, trying to be that facilitator and connector. We certainly understand, and I think this is a very big challenge for everyone, is we coexist across this landscape, and effectively our pastoral lease tenure is not that secure for things like intensive agriculture. Things like diversification permits are difficult for banks to understand. However, if you want to take that step change and you want to create an agricultural lease, or even potentially freehold, you're going to impact somebody else's rights. And that's not just First Nations people, it's mining leases, it's the Crown itself. There's all sorts of complexity around that. But I think we need to have a conversation with our regulators and our government to say, if you wish to see diversity and secure investment in the north, we've really got to have a good discussion around tenure. And part of that is rethinking the model. So there's examples where First Nations people have been able to create tenure that then allows third-party investment, which is quite different to the model, I suppose, where we've had a mainstream investor come in, try to change tenure, and then compensating everyone else. And I really think we need to have a robust discussion around that. And along with that, we've got ever-increasing requirements for engagement, and not just engagement, but consent, social license, and we need to be able to use long-term data to demonstrate the sustainability of our systems. So some of the synergies that we talked about, and this is a strong conversation in the Northern Territory as well, is the synergies between fodder, cotton, cattle, grains, in many cases corn, but could be sorghum and other things. It makes a lot of sense. 30 years ago when I was working on the peanut industry in the north, we weren't having these conversations around synergies. We were trying to, one industry is trying to expand without other industries coming in sync. And I really think that's part of the solution for the north, because one industry cannot stand by itself. Even the pastoral industry, as established as it is, it needs these synergies. We have, and I think it's looking back at our areas and saying, well, what do we do best and how can we synergise with somebody else? We're seeing some really interesting smaller local supply chains. So some of you might have seen an article recently from the Kimberley Aboriginal Pastoral Company, where they have been exporting cows to Bachelor and then importing the meat back into Aboriginal communities. We have the station store, Jack Burton here, who's selling locally cured meat across the Kimberley, and a very successful smaller version of an abattoir. Kimberley Meat Company, as I mentioned before, has had its challenges. There's high hopes that they'll be able to overcome that, and there's a fairly significant investment going into that. Obviously in the Ord, we've seen the emergence of the cotton gin, and then also in Katherine. That then means that cottonseed, and it's not available right now, but potentially cottonseed meal would be available to support the emergence of feed yards and feed lots across the Kimberley. And really, a lot of that is about, our live export market is still very a major player in cattle turn off from the Kimberley, but we're seeing these alternative markets for heavier cattle, cull cows, heifers, things like that, that aren't meeting those specifications, that we're able to use productively elsewhere. So I'd just like to introduce our actual project, the Pastoral Irrigated Agriculture project. It's only a portion of what we do, but we're just finishing this. It's finished, it basically ends in June this year. It was funded by Royalties for Regions, which is the Western Australian program, tipping mining royalties back into other industries. It's been a great funder for us. This particular project sits under the Northern Beef Development Program run by DPIRD. We started it in 2020, went through to 2025. So roughly about 800,000 invested in that. And what it did was enabled us to set up a research site near Broome, which we didn't have. Our department literally owned a couple of demountables on an industrial block. So we have a great partnership with Hancock Agriculture. Prior to that, Graham Rogers, who set up Roebuck Silage and Hay, we entered into a partnership with them. We leased a small area. We purchased an irrigation system and the machinery that we needed. And we have a great little facility which allows us to do this field work that we're about to talk about. Part of the project as well was focusing on some of those policy improvements that I talked about earlier. And one of those examples is non-Indigenous plant policy for pastoral stations. So we don't have time to talk about it in detail, but I think was a great outcome of looking at a policy that really wasn't working that well. It was restricting investment, and it was quite confusing as well for pastoralists to understand what can they apply for and what they can't. And I think there's been a significant improvement in that whole decision-making system, which has allowed pastoralists to have a lot more clarity around their options under diversification permit under the current Western Australian legislation and policy. Mainly what we wanted to do was to provide managers and staff with the ability to access local data that helps them to make the best management decision that they can. And that's really our end goal. So I'd like to segue over to Carla to just explain some of the work we did and some of the outcomes and results of that work.
Hello everyone, my name's Carla and I'm the Development Officer in Chris's team, and I've been working on, been part of this project for the past 4 years. So I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the main higher level take home messages that we've gathered from the past 4 or 5 years. So I've robbed this slide from 2019, which was the last time that Chris spoke to the Beef Connect group. And this is just kind of to set the scene on what the initial project aim was. And it was around the idea of the standard kind of natural feed base having quite a limited digestibility and by extension limited metabolizable energy, ME, which limits dry matter intake and then in turn potential live weight gains to kind of that 0.5 to 0.6 kilos per head per day at best. And even with the existing irrigated agriculture developments that were growing subtropical perennials at the time, such as Rhodes grass, we know we can't really exceed that 9 megajoules per kilo of dry matter, which limits potential live weight gain. And we really wanted to find out how we might produce fodder that has a higher ME over 10 megajoules so that we could achieve live weight gains over a kilo, and what that system might look like. So this is also from that 2019 presentation, showing how subtropical grasses, the relationship between the daily growth rate of the pasture along the x-axis here, and then the ME along the y-axis here are inversely related, or that there's a trade-off between pasture growth and pasture quality. So what industry is really aiming for as a production benchmark in our irrigated systems is this 100, this red dotted line here, that 100 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, which if you average that out over a whole year, gives us kind of about 35 to 40 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. But this also puts us below our quality goal of 10 megajoules. So we've really been gathering data around the production benchmarks of the subtropical grasses and tried to see if there's any other crop options that could put us in that zone of high quality and high quantity. And yeah, as Chris said, prior to the project starting, we didn't have a designated research area that we could manage independently and have control over. So this is just a little drone photo of our research pivot last year. This is just half of it that had some of our perennial grass trials in the foreground, and then our sweet sorghum trial at the back there. We were kind of looking at 3 different types of systems, which is growing perennial grasses for cutting and baling, making hay or silage for a cut and carry system. Then there's perennial grasses for direct grazing, like rotational grazing on the pivots, or growing a rotation of annual crops for grain or silage. So this is the kind of a summary of all of the perennial grass research that we did over 2021 and 2022 at Skewthorpe. And we had plots, this trial was fully replicated and randomized, and we cut the plots every 28-ish days for 2 years. And so you can kind of see the average daily growth rates and then what that equates to over a year, dry matter in tonnes per hectare over the year. So what we really found was that of these 12 different species or varieties of subtropical perennials, the Rhodes grass and the panic grass came out on top as our highest biomass producers. They were just the most consistent over the seasons and over that 2-year period. A couple, this Soteria and Humidicola, were too tropical for our environment, and they kind of didn't persist beyond the first few months. So they really just dropped out of the trial. They never kind of got established well. But yeah, this is kind of what's become our benchmark, our productivity benchmark is kind of that 40 tonnes of dry matter is kind of the opportunity cost of, well, if you didn't grow perennial grasses, how much biomass are you foregoing? And I should also add, this is based on cutting the grasses kind of at least 10 times per year. So it's quite an intensive production system. And those data points from that trial plotted similarly to that other graph with the daily growth rate along the x-axis on the bottom here and then ME on the y-axis, just shows a similar trend which we expected, which is that inverse relationship between quality and quantity. So we notably we didn't see any MEs really above that 10 megajoules. However, these samples are all cut kind of at maturity between 23 and 34 days of regrowth. So if they were cut at an earlier growth stage, we would have seen that higher quality, but this is to kind of achieve this benchmark of 100 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. This is the qualities that we can expect. And I just wanted to color code the exact same points by variety, just to show that there's no kind of trend by variety in terms of like there's no one variety that's high quality and high quantity. The variability is much more explained by seasonality, and just like every cut is slightly different and the length of the cut would be slightly different. So yeah, there's just that variability. We also set up quite a rigorous nitrogen response trial in Rhodes grass to generate a response curve that would inform nitrogen fertilizer decisions. Given that nitrogen is probably the most expensive input into most of these systems, whether that be for direct grazing or for producing hay. So this here summarizes our findings for productivity. This is showing the kilograms per hectare per day of dry matter, tons per hectare per year of dry matter by nitrogen inputs, and this is kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per day, including a zero nitrogen control. And what you can kind of see here is just that the dry matter response kind of plateaus between 2 and 3 units per day, and the grass stops responding in yield beyond 3 units. If we add in the crude protein levels to that as well, you can see that the crude protein response is more linear. So at this point, you kind of need to know what the purpose of the Rhodes grass fodder is. And if it's the sole source of nutrition for cattle, you could probably get away with aiming for a 12% crude protein, aside from feeding calves or young weaners. Just given that the metabolizable energy of the fodder, as we've just discussed, is below 10 megajoules per kilo, then any more than 12% crude protein is not really utilizable. And yeah, this research has been really helpful in kind of supporting industry to understand their nitrogen inputs and basically not over apply nitrogen. And yeah, we also went a little bit further to look at the nitrogen use efficiency, specifically the efficiency of applied nitrogen at those same input rates. And if we just first look at the green line, which is nitrogen recovery, and that refers to this axis on the right-hand side, this is simply the N recovered in above ground biomass, which is yield multiplied by crude protein. And then you can see that even when no nitrogen is applied, there is still uptake of over half a unit of nitrogen per day, just from the N cycling in the background. And then nitrogen use efficiency is shown in blue and the axis on the left-hand side. And really what you can just see is that as you put more units of nitrogen on, the efficiency declines, which is, the trend that we also expected to see, but we wanted to put some numbers around that as well. So it peaks at 65% at 1 unit of nitrogen, and by 3 units it's dropped to that 50% efficiency. And this is kind of considered a fair benchmark, but obviously we would like to do whatever we can possibly do to improve the nitrogen use efficiency and get more out of our inputs and just create a more efficient system. So at this point, I just wanted to take this opportunity to spruik this series of 3 videos that we produced. These are a series called Grazing Irrigated Pastures in Northern Australia, and they are featuring Dr. Kevin Bell, who at the time was working as the Innovations Manager at Pardue Station, and he is sharing some of the knowledge that he's gained through that role and just his whole career and life, and they're really, really informative and worth a watch when you have more time. Okay, so yeah, I'd highly recommend having a watch of those if you have time. So as well as refining the perennial grass systems and trying to answer pasture management questions, we have done some investigations into other annual crop options that might be able to lift feed quality. So things like maize, sweet sorghum, other forage sorghums and legumes as well. And we've kind of still seen that there's that trade-off between biomass quantity and quality. So it's really horses for courses. I guess ultimately the project set out to see if we can create a locally produced feedlot ration that's cost effective and economically viable. And as Chris kind of alluded to previously, we've found that we can do part of it, but there's probably still elements that we need to import or buy into the region, just in terms of there being that opportunity cost of not growing biomass, because that's the expensive thing to freight in, but it depends on really what you're doing. So there's people that are doing all sorts of things. It really depends on, it's a case by case of what suits different people in different situations. So yes, another thing that kind of takes up a lot of our time is looking into the various pests that are cropping up. So yeah, they're an ever-present challenge. There's fall armyworm, obviously. We've just been learning how to manage those pests alongside industry. Another thing that comes to the area from time to time is locusts. In the past few years, we've had swarms of yellow-winged locusts, we've had migratory locusts, and we've had spur-throated locusts. So every year there's something new. We've got aphids, and we've got our latest thing that we're trying to figure out is these cockchafer grubs that are destroying the rhodes grass pastures. So, and yeah, the list goes on. Soil constraints as well is something that we're starting to turn our attention to more and more. Just quickly touch on as well the DPIRD's got a dryland silo project, which is being led by Jeff Moore. For those who don't have access to groundwater or don't want to pursue an irrigation pathway, this work is trying to look into how best to establish silos in dryland native pastures. I'll hand back over to Chris for a quick summary.
Thanks, Carla. Excuse me. Just to wrap up, I guess the purpose of our presentation was really around what have we done to adapt and adopt in the last 5 years since 2019. And I think I'd be interested to hear from some of the industry players online, but I think there's been a great adoption of some of the work that we've done. And I'd also like to point out that we learn as much of the pastoralists and the managers and their staff as they learn off us. It's very much a shared synergy, and they see things that we don't see because we're not out there every day trying to manage these systems. We do get the chance to visit and hear about that. I guess our role is to try to take that away and try to take these individual issues that people struggle to have the time or the money or the patience to sit down and work out, and come back hopefully with at least a bit more information, if not an answer. I think we've certainly seen a change in fertiliser efficiency. We've really had some really challenging questions around biodiversity in the cropping systems and soil health, integrated pest management, but the ultimate thing is really around evidence-based decision making. And I think at this point, success is the most important thing. And if we can be successful, even though we may be relatively small in the scheme of things, I think we've done very well. Our future direction, this is a little bit broader than just our team, but it's just our thinking at the moment. As I mentioned, there's a number of very exciting opportunities for First Nations people, and I think they really need to be considered, particularly given that right across the north we're talking about significant Indigenous water reserves, and a water reserve that isn't able to be enabled is really basically an environmental reserve. So it's really around you know, what are people interested in and how can we help support them? Obviously preparing for the future. Carbon emissions, particularly emissions in this part of the world, but climate resilience is going to be a very big part of what we do. Underneath that are more specific issues around soil health, animal production, development of industries, and I think the challenge there is that everyone's developing incrementally, but can we synchronise the synergies between us to help smooth the bumps out of those incremental steps? And particularly we need to look at our industry credentials and our environmental impact, off-site impact, and have that difficult conversation around developing, particularly in areas of Kimberley where it is particularly sensitive, and understand that we can coexist and we can do that sustainably and we can do it responsibly. Our bigger challenge, which goes a bit beyond our department, is really around developing our communities and our supporting services. You know, I've lost staff because they can't get childcare here in Broome. We've got all those challenges in front of us, but we need to continue to inform how we can work together on that. At that stage, that's the end of our presentation, and I'd like to throw back to Greg for any questions that the audience may have. But thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate it.